ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Robert Black College of the University of Hong Kong, I have pleasure in presenting the annual Kenneth Robinson Fellowship Lecture of 1999 to you. Now I would like to call upon our Vice Chancellor, Professor Y.C. Jiang, to say a few words before the lecture. Professor Jiang, please.
Good evening, Professor Gutmann, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Robinson Fellowship Lecture of 1999. Those of you who are new to Hong Kong may wonder what Kenneth Robinson Fellowship Lecture is. Let me briefly explain that Professor Kenneth Robinson is our former Vice Chancellor, during whose tenure our Robert Black College was founded. The Robert Black College is a residence for the university visitors and scholars and graduate students. In honor of Professor Kenneth Robinson, the Robert Black College has set up a fellowship in his name to invite annually an outstanding and internationally renowned scholar to pay a lecturing visit to the university. Tonight, we are very happy to welcome Professor Amy Gutmann, who has been awarded the Kenneth Robinson Fellowship this year. Professor Gutmann was awarded her bachelor degree at Harvard, her master degree at the London School of Economics, and her PhD degree again at Harvard. She is currently the chair professor of politics and the dean of the faculty at Princeton University. Her wide-ranging academic and research interests include moral and political philosophy, practical ethics, education, and public affairs. While the Robert Black College acts as Professor Gutmann's host, she is an academic visitor to our Department of Philosophy, Politics and Public Administration, and the Faculty of Education. Truly, you're very talented to help so many departments. This evening, Professor Gutmann will speak to us on the subject of what is so special about democracy, on which she has done extensive research. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Professor Gutmann a big hand.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's my first time in Hong Kong, and indeed my first time in this part of the world. So I don't speak to you as an expert at all about your country or the world in this area. I'm going to speak to you about something that's more general, at the same time I think applicable to all of our lives, and that is the subject of democracy. I thank my hosts very much, Professor Wong and Professor Chang. Thank you very much for having me. So my question for this afternoon is, what's so special about democracy? The International Herald recently ran a story entitled, "With Joyful Optimism, Bali Relishes Democracy." Many of you may have read this story. It just ran last week, and the story begins as follows. From the tense streets of Jakarta to the uneasy villages of East Timor, democracy is making unsteady progress in this far-flung Asian country. But here on the tropical island of Bali, democratic-style politics is bursting out with a joyful clamor. People here are exercising their new political freedom with cheerful abandon. "This is fun," Katut, a 34-year-old auto mechanic in this small coastal town, said as he manned a roadside stand festooned with banners for a popular presidential candidate, Megawati Sukarno Putri, who's actually running on the Democratic Party ticket in favor of pluralism, uniting all the different ethnic groups. Now, Katoot, whom I don't think any of us know, who says this is fun, is not expressing what I think is so special about democracy. Democracy is more common now than ever before, but it is not always so much fun, or at least that is not, I think, what most recommends democracy. Democracy is still, as it has always been, a highly contested form of government and a highly contested concept. And so I want to ask, is democracy just one form of government among many others? Or is there something positively special about it, something that should lead us to expect democracy to become increasingly common as favorable conditions for its development increase around the world? Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. I think that's right, but if that's the only thing that recommends democracy, we still would want it, but there would be not very much positive to be said in its favor, except that it avoids evils more than other governments. So I want to question whether there is something positively special about democracy. And to answer this question, we need to consider the meaning of democracy and its relationship to the dominant non-democratic conception of government. And that dominant non-democratic conception is ruled by experts, by people who are more expert, more educated, more technically astute than the average ordinary citizen who gets the vote in a democracy. So in this lecture, I'm going to examine the most common conceptions of democracy, 3 such conceptions: procedural democracy, constitutional democracy, and deliberative democracy. And I want to consider the relationship of what I will argue is the strongest of the 3 conceptions, deliberative democracy, what its relationship is, and compare it with the strongest alternative to democracy, ruled by experts. I'll argue that there is something special about democracy, something that is rooted in democracy's core commitments. A commitment to treat human beings as civic equals, and a commitment to expect human beings to justify coercive laws and institutions to those who are bound by them. Only in a democracy are people treated as active subjects and not just as objects of government. Only in a democracy are people expected to take a public and not merely a private perspective on the value of publicly binding laws and institutions. That's basically what I will argue, but it's not so simple, as you know. So I want to begin with the question now: why should people who are not public officials care about government when there are so many other important aspects of our lives that command our attention and that contribute to our satisfaction in life? Our family, our work, our religion, our recreational activities. Most of us do not find voting or putting out political banners as much fun as the man in Bali does. Why should we want a democracy which demands so much more of us than other forms of government do? Well, democracy offers the fairest way of dealing with our disagreements. Our disagreements about mutually binding laws and institutions. Now, if we didn't disagree with one another, we would not need government as we know it. Experts among us could set up an administration that did all we agreed needed to be done. If we agreed, then all we need to do is make sure the most technically proficient experts set up institutions. Our lives would not need to include any component of what's commonly called in democratic societies citizenship. But members of every society on the face of this earth do disagree about how our collective lives should be run, and we have more reason to distrust than to trust rulers who are not accountable to us. So one thing that is special about democracy is tied to its way of dealing with disagreements that arise among people who share a single society, but who do not share a single sense of what should be done about all the matters that mutually affect us. We cannot simply trust our rulers to act in the public interest without mechanisms of public accountability. But what, then, is democracy's way of dealing with our disagreements? This question requires us to figure out what kind of government we take democracy to be. The simplest understanding of democracy answers this question procedurally, and the simplest understanding of democracy, which we could call procedural democracy, is majoritarian. It recommends majoritarianism. So let's begin with understanding what the procedural answer to dealing with our disagreements is, the procedurally democratic answer. A procedural democracy gives all adult members of society the right to vote. It holds free, fair, and frequent elections of public officials. It secures the rule of law. It secures freedom of speech, at least of political speech, freedom of press, and freedom of association. Is procedural democracy an adequate conception of democracy? Suppose that the minimal conditions of procedural democracy are in place in a society. The citizenry includes all adult members of society. Members of society are governed by the will of the majority, or their accountable representatives. What the majority decides resolves the moral conflict as a matter of law or policy at any particular time. And once the matter is resolved by the majority, the representatives of the majority, the rule of law kicks in. And there are institutions that make sure that the will of the majority is carried out. This is a procedural democracy, and many societies around the world have not been democratic even to this extent. South Africa under apartheid was not democratic. The United States under slavery was not democratic. It excluded significant parts of the adult population, and so on. Procedural democracy is not an easy thing to bring about. Yet someone might ask a different question, not a question about whether we can bring it about, but a question about whether it's justifiable. Is procedural democracy the most justifiable, the most defensible version of democracy? Does majority rule adequately respect the moral claims of individuals? Let me give you a simple example that can clarify the moral problem with democracy understood as majoritarianism. Sometimes it's good to clarify a moral problem by giving the simplest example, shorn of all the complexity. So let me begin with a simple, very simple example, which I think will focus in on what the problem with procedural democracy is and why so many people who have questions about democracy might look at procedural democracy and say, what's so special about this? Why should we want democracy if this is what we're going to get? If we're going to get majoritarianism, if we're going to get purely procedural democracy. Now, I hope you see the attraction of procedural democracy as well. It enfranchises adults as citizens. It establishes certain freedoms. But here's the example. Imagine yourself with 4 other people in a railway car. And let's just imagine that I'm one of the 4 other people. So it's you, me, and 3 other people on a railway car. There are 5 of us. None of us wants to leave unless we're forced to do so. Some of us wish to smoke, and some of us object to anyone smoking in our presence. Now, how should the conflict be resolved? Majoritarianism has a simple answer. We should vote. We should all vote, and all our votes should be counted as equal. The appeal of letting majority preference determine the outcome is, as the political philosopher Brian Barry describes, that majority rule counts everyone's preference equally. It respects us in this sense all as civic equals. Now, Brian Barry then imagines that a third passenger in this railway car is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Brian Barry is British, so that's what he imagines, as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop claims the right to decide the smoking question on the basis of his social position and his presumptive expertise in casuistry. Now, if some of us reject his claim, it is difficult to see how the question can be settled except by a vote. If the Archbishop finds himself in the minority, it must be because he has failed to convince you and me, or enough of us, two more of us, that he is right, that he has the right to decide. He may continue to insist that his view should have been accepted, but in the face of actual rejection of a minority view, the case for deferring to the majority decision looks strong. This, in microcosm, is the case for procedural democracy. But the case cannot be so simply settled. Things look different if we start to introduce some more realistic complexity into this example. Suppose two of the passengers, and let's suppose those two are you and me, argue as follows. Non-smokers should not be subject to the substantial health risks of smoke. And smokers are also harming themselves by smoking. So it's in no one's interest to smoke in this railway car. The vote is taken, and we, the two health-minded passengers, lose 3-2. Now, if the health risks are minor and uncertain, the case for majority rule still looks pretty strong. But suppose you and I have asthma, and we may have an asthma attack if the other passengers smoke. The risks are likely to be great, and the case for majority rule weakens. Our confidence in majority rule seems to decline as the health risks increase in severity and likelihood. As the risks to the welfare, to the basic welfare of some citizens increases, there is a decreasing confidence that pure majority rule is clearly the right way to resolve this question. Now, what does this example help to highlight about the appeal of majority rule and its limits? The appeal of majority rule all by itself depends on conditions that are rarely satisfied in any society, and rarely satisfied even in democratic societies. One condition is that the majority must not infringe on the vital interests of individuals. The majority must not pass laws that in effect kill some members of the minority or restrict their basic liberties or basic opportunities. If you and I know that we're likely to suffer a severe asthma attack from tobacco smoke, we may not be bound by a majority decision in favor of smoking. Decisions that violate the vital interests of any citizen cannot be justified simply by virtue of the fact that they result from majority rule or any other generally implemented procedure. So the railway car example shows that some decisions consistent with procedural democracy may not be justified. Imposing life-threatening health risks on a few people for the sake of satisfying the preferences of the greater number may not be justified. We need to see whether democracy in practice and in theory can do better than to be purely procedural. So if democracy is special because it tries to respect the moral claims of every individual, then the most defensible understanding of democracy will be one that take the moral claims of individuals more seriously than a conception of democracy that says whatever the majority decides goes. A democracy that's better than a procedural democracy would be designed, if possible, so that majority rule is not authorized to overrule the basic liberties and the basic opportunities of individuals. Democracy will be more defensible to the extent that majority rule either is constrained or constrains itself to respect the basic liberties and the basic opportunities of individuals. So to develop a better conception, let's consider the railway car example once again and modify it slightly, also in the direction of more realism. Suppose you are a doctor and you're on the car and you have specialized knowledge about the health risks of smoking. I have no specialized knowledge, and I'm undecided about whether smoking should be permitted in the car. I want to hear more from you about the pros and cons of the smoking issue before I vote. And I also want other people to be able to hear what you have to say as well. After all, you have knowledge about something that not everybody else has. Now, no one in this railway car now objects to majority rule as the ultimate decision-making rule. But two of us, you and I again, we're the allies in this example, two of us object to simply taking a vote, to not discussing the issue, to not hearing from the experts, to not arguing about it before we vote. We both think it's important to focus in on what the deliberative conception of the democracy will introduce. We both think it's important to discuss the substance of the question publicly, to discuss both the facts and the values involved here before we vote. Purely procedural principles such as majority rule are silent about this aspect of decision-making that is often of crucial importance in politics. The nature of the evidence, the arguments, and the claims that are made in public before people vote. It would be a serious mistake to judge democracy simply by its voting rules and not by whether democracy is designed and citizens are encouraged to deliberate about their disagreements before voting. To deliberate is to give and to get reasons for and against a proposal before the proposal is decided in a mutually binding way. To deliberate is also to be prepared in a way, to be educated in a way that makes it possible for you and your fellow citizens to understand what's at stake at issues, to understand what other people's views are, to be able to hear them and to be able to respond to them. When we judge how special democracy is, we should pay attention to what kind of discussions take place, who engages in them, the quality of their arguments, and whether and how people respond to each other's opinions and values. Deliberation is an indispensable part of any democratic process that seeks justifiable resolutions to moral disagreements. Deliberation is indispensable to democracy for at least two important reasons. One is an instrumental reason. Deliberation increases the chances of us arriving at morally good decisions, at decisions that are actually justifiable to the people who are bound by them. And the second is an intrinsic reason. By their willingness and ability to deliberate, democratic citizens and public officials demonstrate that they respect each other as civic equals. They demonstrate that they're willing and able to pay attention to the concerns of their neighbors, to the concerns of their fellow citizens. And that's an important part of what justifies democracy in the first place, a civic-mindedness among citizens and an accountability of public officials to citizens to encourage public officials as well to be civic-minded. Now, proceduralism does not so much reject this as it neglects this aspect of democracy. It neglects all of those practices, all of those institutions and culture that would encourage people to be civic-minded and not simply to vote, but also to think, to argue, to understand what politics is about. If all that could be said in favor of a morally controversial decision is that a majority voted for it, then that's not enough to justify many controversial decisions. Some majority decisions are not morally acceptable because they violate the basic liberties or opportunities of individuals. For example, by restricting the religious freedom of minorities. A morally defensible conception of democracy must go beyond proceduralism and make room for moral judgments, not only of procedures, but also of their results. Now, this brings us to the constitutional dimension of democracy. Constitutional Democrats make democracy more defensible. They make it more defensible by saying that the rights of individuals need to be protected in a democracy. Procedures alone are not enough. Democracy should also recommend and respect the rights of individuals. But the problem with constitutional democracy by itself is that it doesn't recognize something that I've already introduced into the railway car example. It doesn't recognize that people quite reasonably also disagree about what rights are the right rights to have in a society. How much freedom of speech? How much freedom of association? What do we think about the legalization of violent pornography, of prostitution, of abortion, of capital punishment? These are all questions of the rights of individuals, but they're not questions the answer to which has been established once and for all among reasonable people. These are very controversial questions, and a society that institutes or conceives of itself as a democracy that does not recognize how important it is to deliberate about these questions is inadequate. To go back to the railway car example, suppose you and I vote against smoking, and we both have asthma. The majority votes to permit smoking. Does this policy count as violating our basic liberty, or does it count as protecting the liberty of smokers? Is our basic liberty violated if the smoking policy risks only minor damage to our health and the smokers on the train get a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of smoking? These are difficult questions, and as you can see, the question on the railway car has its parallels in society. Many of us think pollution is bad and violates our right to clean air. But how clean does the air have to be until our rights are satisfied? This is something that there is no philosopher king or queen, as far as I know, among us who we could recognize as having the uniquely right answer to. And these are questions about what constitute our basic liberties and opportunities. Do public policies that limit environmental pollution protect or violate basic liberty? How much pollution is so much that it violates a basic liberty of individuals? The problem is not simply that we need more facts about the risk and the consequences of pollution. The problem is that even with as much information as we can have, someone would still have to decide what risks to impose and whether and why a certain level of risk violates or protects our basic liberty. Now, besides our basic liberties, there is the question of whether we also have welfare rights. This is a question that my democracy, the United States, has not been very good at asking or answering. Some democracies, some constitutional democracies, focus much more on basic liberties than on basic opportunities of individuals. So if we also have welfare rights, an important question, rights to basic opportunities such as health care, education, police protection, how much and by whom should they be provided? A deliberative conception of democracy supplements constitutional democracy by supporting deliberation about such issues throughout government and civil society, by supporting educational institutions that not only inform citizens about politics, but also encourage citizens to discuss political issues with one another. Democracy is special insofar as it enfranchises all adults, protects basic liberties, such as speech, press, and association, and protects basic opportunities as well. But rights are not enough, and procedures are not enough. We cannot count on a majority any more than a minority to hand down the uniquely correct set of rights, liberties, and opportunities. Democracy will be special to the extent that its citizens achieve a higher degree of political competence and to the extent that citizens and public officials have a more stable commitment to justice than not to do justice, and then alternate forms of government. Political competence and moral commitment among a citizenry are more broadly sustained to the extent that citizens are well educated about politics, encouraged to evaluate their laws and public policies, encouraged to articulate what they think about public matters, and to justify what they think to their fellow citizens. Deliberation is therefore at least as important in everyday politics, in what I call middle democracy, as it is in the highest courts of the land. Now I want to consider the strongest critique of this ideal of democracy, of deliberative democracy. A critic of democracy now asks, if deliberation is so special and important, if it's such an essential part of democracy, and if making wise decisions is so important that we can't just rely on simple majority rule, why defend deliberation among the masses rather than among an educated elite? And this is the classical, indeed enduring, challenge to any form of democracy. And it's a particularly important challenge to deliberative democracy because deliberative democracy agrees that it's important that people not only vote, but that they know something, that they argue, that they understand something about what they're voting on. That they not just be ruled by a majority, but they also be ruled in some way by an intelligent majority. Deliberation isn't easy. The critic says, would it not be morally better and more realistic to defend deliberation only among those members of the society who are most educated and most adept at deliberation? So some defenders of deliberation are not Democrats, but they're what one might call deliberative elitists. They recognize the importance of extensive moral deliberation, but they want to contain it because they think it's most effective, not throughout society, not through all political institutions, but in the institution that they think is most effective, can do the best job at deliberation. In the United States, that institution is often identified as the Supreme Court. And many deliberative elitists argue that judges should interpret constitutional principles by engaging in moral deliberation, but that legislatures and citizens should not, need not, and cannot deliberate. They should defer to judges. This is an elitist conception of deliberation, and it suffers from several problems. Let me just mention one now, and I think that it's a quite fatal problem. It suffers from the problem of internal inconsistency. That is, what deliberative elitists say is that we need the Supreme Court in the United States or some analogous institution in another society to deliberate for us. But we can't and we shouldn't look to deliberation more generally in what I call middle democracy, because people will make mistakes. They're not experts. Well, now let's think about what the problem with this argument is. Judges are not experts on a lot of the moral decisions that come before them. Courts often make mistakes. Judges often disagree on the court, and many decisions on courts are split decisions. The United States Supreme Court, for many years of our history, continued to justify slavery, which was certainly a moral mistake. Defenders of deliberative elitism don't take any of these facts to be a reason to diminish the role of deliberation among judges. And they're right. None of these facts is a good reason to diminish the role of deliberation among judges. When good arguments fail to carry sufficient weight in the judicial process, we should urge, and deliberative elitists urge, more deliberation, better deliberation. They try to find ways of creating greater incentives for judges to get deliberation done well, rather than poorly. Now, the same arguments hold for deliberation more generally in society. And deliberative elitists just ignore that fact. If deliberation doesn't work well as we would like it to generally in society, we should be urging better educational institutions, more incentives for public officials to deliberate in legislatures, and generally a public culture that's more receptive to deliberation. Now, this is a defense of democratic deliberation quite generally. Justifying coercive laws and public policies to the people who are bound by those laws and policies requires broader deliberation than just among an elite. The strongest challenge to democratic deliberation is the Platonic challenge. It's the argument that the elite's greater competence, or what Plato called the elite's techne, gives them the right to rule. All arguments for exclusive rule, all anti-democratic arguments, if they are serious, Michael Walzer, the political philosopher who gave this lecture several years ago, writes in Spheres of Justice, all such arguments are arguments from special knowledge. Just as we buy our shoes from a craftsman skilled in shoemaking, so we should receive our laws from a craftsman skilled in ruling. Plato famously imagines a democratic ship. In the democratic ship, Plato says, the sailors are quarreling over the control of the helm. Each thinks he ought to be steering the vessel, although he has never learned navigation. And he can't point to any teacher under whom he has served his apprenticeship. What is more, the people on board the ship assert that navigation is a thing that cannot be taught at all, and they're ready to tear to pieces anyone who says it can. This is a ship that doesn't have at its helm anyone who is competent at steering the ship. Now, none of us would want to be on such a ship. The same, Plato suggests, is true of the ship of state. None of us would want to be, Plato suggests, on the democratic ship of state. When democratic citizens quarrel over who should control the government and where to steer it, they put themselves and us in danger. The masses would be wise to let the ship be steered by those who have special knowledge of how political power is to be exercised. That's, in essence, the strongest argument that's ever been made against any conception of democracy. Ordinary people don't know how to steer the ship of state. The more we know about politics, however, the more problematic this analogy becomes. The pilot of the ship doesn't choose the port. His technical skill does not extend to the choice of a destination. Technical knowledge is very important for politics, but it doesn't determine what counts as the most justifiable ends. Politicians, like pilots and like shoemakers, need to be authorized by and accountable to the people who are most affected by the laws and policies that are made in our name. Laws and policies that bind the people need to be justified to the people. And if people are to be treated as civic equals, they must have the authority to hold politicians accountable. They must be able to require that politicians give justifications of the policies they make in our name. I am not an expert at how to steer the ship of state, but neither is anybody else. There are experts, though, in budgeting, in accounting, in foreign policy, and all the kinds of things that will be needed once citizens decide in what direction of the controversial directions the ship of state should be steered. So it doesn't follow that to support deliberative democracy is to push out experts. Quite the contrary. Experts are necessary in every democracy, just as they're necessary in non-democratic societies. But expertise has its limits, and democracy recognizes the limits of expertise. It also doesn't follow that all democratic decisions are equally good if citizens choose them. If all destinations were equally good, there'd be no need for democracy or deliberation. We could just choose policies by lottery. Some people have said they'd rather be governed by lottery than actually William Buckley, a conservative politician in the United States, conservative thinker in the United States, has said he would rather be governed by a random selection of names from any phone book than by the professors at Harvard University. He didn't say Princeton University, so I can tell you the story. And that's a conservative thinker speaking. But citizens can't do as well without education as they can do with education. They can't do as well without moral motivation as they can do with what I call civic integrity and civic magnanimity. The integrity of saying what you believe, the integrity of the magnanimity of taking other people's interests and values into account. Deliberation is special in democracy because it makes a difference in the quality of outcomes, and also because it expresses respect for people with whom you disagree. The value of deliberation doesn't reside only in the policies it produces. It also resides in the way policies are produced. The hard choices that governments make under conditions of scarcity are more legitimate the more the competing claims are considered on their merits. Deliberative democracy is also valuable for a reason that John Stuart Mill famously articulated. Mill argued that by participating in political discussion, a citizen is, quote, called upon to weigh interests not his own, to be guided in the case of conflicting claims by another rule than his partial perspective, to apply at every turn principles and maxims which have for their reason of existence the common good. Citizens are encouraged to take a broader view of issues, to consider the claims of more people in a deliberative democracy. Now, is a deliberative democracy the best form of government for all societies, here and now? Not necessarily. Under some social and economic conditions, deliberative democracy is not a realistic alternative. But deliberative democracy is special because it, and only it, is dedicated to the idea that coercive laws, policies, and institutions need to be justified to the people who are bound by them. When people in power act as if they do not need to justify their decisions to those who are affected by them, they are denying not only the demands of deliberation, but also the demands of basic morality. To treat people as agents, not just as objects. Deliberation without democracy is dangerous. And so is democracy without deliberation. Deliberation without democracy and democracy without deliberation both threaten society with unaccountable power. In the case of deliberation without democracy, the majority is threatened by the unaccountable power of the minority. In the case of democracy without deliberation, minorities are threatened with the unaccountable power of majorities. We can do better, but only if we aim for a deliberative and a democratic government. I therefore conclude that deliberative democracy is so special because it speaks to our ever-increasing need for more mutual understanding in the conduct of our increasingly mutual lives. The need for mutual understanding and respect is greater today in our increasingly interdependent and diverse societies than it has ever been before. We should not, therefore, be surprised. Indeed, I think we should expect that deliberative democracy becomes an increasingly popular conception of politics, and democracy spreads even further across the globe, putting both non-democratic forms of government and non-deliberative forms of democracy on the defensive. Deliberative democracy is an aspiration that speaks to the capacity of human beings to live together with mutual respect and understanding amidst our ongoing disagreements. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, now we have got the solution for the world, deliberate democracy. Would you like someone to challenge this solution? I think Professor Gutmann would welcome questions and comments on her lecture. Please, Professor Xiang.
As a constitution lawyer myself, I'm a little puzzled by your definition of constitutional democracy. You define it as a democracy based on rights, but then you go on to say that, or you imply that constitutional democracy does not provide for a process or a mechanism to determine the scope of rights or the balancing of rights. I hope I understand you. You look because of that. And it seems to me that that is a misconception of constitutional democracy. In one sense, as I listened to you, I thought that deliberative democracy was a fancy word for constitutional democracy. Constitutional democracy does, it seems to me, provide various frameworks for deliberation. You mentioned yourself the role of the courts, the Supreme Court particularly, as a deliberative process. But I would say that the Constitution also sets up deliberation at more political levels. Most good constitutions should have something about the legislative process, which is a process of deliberation. The rules formulated for the different stages of the legislative process are concerned with deliberation. Even the administrative process is one of deliberation because there's a notion of due process, there's a notion of reasonableness of decisions. And all of these seem to me compel some form of deliberation, presentation of arguments, data, evidence, evaluation of evidence, and so on. So it seems to me that constitutional democracy is concerned with much more than just rights. It's concerned with a wider set of issues. And for each of these issues, it seeks to set up a framework which I would call a deliberative framework. Now, my problem with your deliberative democracy is how do you induce deliberation? I agree with you that the benefits of deliberation that you all can patent, world of that. But how do you get deliberation? Many countries have tried to create democratic structures or deliberative kind through the constitution and haven't succeeded. There's emphasis on elections, and after elections, there's very much discussion on policy making or consultation. Today we live in a world dominated by multinational corporations, by media corporations. How do you get in that context a true deliberation when the instruments of deliberation are dominated by a handful of corporations? A lot of people are cut off from the process of deliberation because of lack of education, lack of access, lack of wealth. And so I would like very much to hear you say what are the ways in which one can promote deliberation and meaningful deliberation. What are the frameworks for deliberation? You could have very distorted framework. Ethnicity is a framework for deliberation. So how do you get the benefits of deliberation that you mentioned in practice?
Well, your statement really has two parts, and one is I welcome greatly, which is that constitutional democracy supports deliberation. I agree. Deliberative democracy accepts both procedures and constitutionalism as a very important and valuable parts of democracy. And so the more supporters of constitutional democracy agree that it supports and encourages and indeed shows that deliberation can work, the better. That I have no disagreement with whatsoever. But notice what happened. The first part of what you said, you were saying how in constitutional democracy deliberation works. It actually, there are many institutions that can be deliberative, and a constitutional democracy that's deliberative will encourage deliberation in legislatures as well as courts and so on. But then the second part of your question is skepticism that deliberation can work, but the skepticism was limited to the non-constitutional parts of democracy, and I wonder why. I mean, there's nothing unique. I mean, the globalization of the world is something that creates difficult problems across the board. And I agree that we have to look increasingly for more and better forms of deliberation, institutions that will support deliberation. So let me give you two concrete examples of the way we can support greater deliberation throughout society, and that would increase the quality of deliberation in courts and legislatures and in everyday, what I call middle democracy. One is in our educational systems to teach more about the political systems of society and the world, the way economics and politics interact, and to teach students to discuss and argue about these issues. That would make a big difference. A lot of educational systems don't do that very well, and we could do much better. A lot of educational systems are much better at technical education than at civic education. That's one way. Another way is to design political institutions so that they give incentives more for deliberation about public policy and the things that affect people's lives than they do about money raising. In my country, in the United States, we have a political system in which public officials have to spend most of their time raising money rather than making policy and debating the issues. So those are two ways. Now, deliberation it's an aspiration. We're never going to have the perfect deliberative democracy. It's meant to be an aspirational goal.
Shall we have the second question? Yes.
Actually, it's two questions. One is, you might agree that constitutional democracy supports deliberation, but it may not be true the other way around. I think, judging from what you said, deliberative democracy might not support one particular mechanism for constitutionalism, which is judicial review. If ordinary citizens can deliberate as equally well as Supreme Court judges in the states, then why should we give so much power to a group of elites to decide what rights the American citizens should have? This is my first question. The second question is, I just wonder to what extent the idea and principles of deliberative democracy can be applicable in the case of universities, modern universities such as Princeton University or the University of Hong Kong.
That's the toughest question, right? Well, I was dean of the faculty for for years at Princeton, and you might ask whether I practiced what I preached. I don't think universities are democracies. I don't really think they should. But I do think they ought to be deliberative bodies. And I actually found that the skills and virtues of deliberation were very useful, not just for me, but for colleagues and those who practice them. People tend both to get better decisions when they deliberate, and that's true in universities, and people who disagree with the outcome feel respected, and rightly so, when their views have been addressed on their merits, rather than just ignored. So that's the second, and probably the more difficult part of your question, since universities are difficult places to make decisions, even more difficult than democracies sometimes. The first question is a very good one as well. Deliberative democracy does support judicial review, although judicial review might not be the only way of protecting minority rights, but it is one way of protecting minority rights. And deliberation among citizens can confirm the institution of judicial review. Deliberative democracy doesn't say that citizens have to vote on every policy and on every right. Deliberative democracy says that any institution ought to be accountable to, in some way, to the citizens. If it is true that minority rights need to be protected against majorities, having a body that's appointed by elected officials, which the Supreme Court is, that is insulated from majoritarian pressures at the moment to restrict unpopular speech, is an institution that can be defended by deliberative democracy. And in the United States, I think judicial review is defended in a deliberative way. In fact, we've had more deliberation about judicial review in the United States than about many other aspects of our system. But judicial review isn't the only place that deliberation should occur. And that's very important. We need deliberation in legislatures and other places as well.
Well, shall we have maybe one more question?
I'm surprised you didn't say more about the willingness of the minority to accept the decisions of the majority. When the democracy fails, that more often seems to be one of the major causes.
Right. Well, one of the virtues of deliberation is that it helps legitimize unpopular decisions when they can be justified. Now, there are two kinds of minority resistance to democratic decisions. One is when the minority is resisting justifiable decisions, and another was when the minority is resisting unjustifiable decisions. If a deliberative democracy helps us get better decisions, and if it also, even when the decisions aren't the best decisions, enables minorities to have a voice in them and gives reasons that minorities can argue with, minorities are more likely to be able, respectfully, to go along with majority decisions. Now, there can be cases in any society where minority rights are so trampled that they ought not to go along with the decision. But the genius of deliberative democracy is that it needs to justify decisions to minorities as well as to majorities.
I know that some of you still have questions to ask, but we do have a reception after this lecture so that you'll be free to ask Professor Gutmann. And I know also that part of you were talking about democracy, so I don't know whether the majority are in a hurry to go to the next function. I know many of you are very busy. So I would now like to ask the... I will take a vote. I would now like to ask Professor Moore to propose a vote of thanks to the speaker.
Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, Professor Gutmann has presented me with a small problem. It is an agreeable task to offer this vote of thanks, but the terminology is a vote. I had to ask myself whether to conceive of this as a matter of procedure or a kind of informal constitution.
All my deliberation.
But I think, luckily, that doesn't really arise, and perhaps we can actually learn something from this about communal life in our way of responding to your lecture. It's been, a pleasure and a privilege and a stimulus to hear your lecture, and I think we do not need to take either a secret ballot or even a show of hands, but simply to clap our hands in thanks.
So ladies and gentlemen, you're invited to a reception outside this hall. Thank you very much for coming to support this function.